Chapter 15, Short Story, Part 1 of The Kids of NIMH. Note from the author. Some readers may find the following content highly disturbing and controversial. The next two chapters are fictional dramatizations based on real events that I experienced as a youth in the American foster care system. Although the setting of the story takes place in an alternate timeline in the future, the things that take place in this short story are far from fiction. I watched many of my orphan friends fall prey to the pharmakia system, many never recovering. The story and characters are fictional, and allegory is used to help articulate the amount of damage this nation has done to our children through the forced use of mind-altering substances. As a displaced youth in the foster care system and later employment as a psychiatric technician, I experienced firsthand the tyranny of Big Pharma, a regimen of daily pills forced upon underage children to chemically restrain their minds is no less than satanic ritualized abuse. All the treatments of the children in this chapter, besides the arm amputation, are true experiences that I witnessed firsthand. There is no separation between hospital and state. Where the government drops off its control over us, pharmakia companies pick back up. In a world where anyone can be held against their will, chemically raped and lobotomized to the point that they cannot defend themselves or complain, none of us are free. People, and even children, should have autonomy over their bodies and not be forced to take drugs against their will. The masses should not have their jobs and livelihoods threatened if they do not comply with mandated inoculations. How can we trust anyone who threatens our rights and freedoms? Chapter 15, Short Story, Part 1 of The Kids of NIMH. Synopsis. Two children perform a sacrificial ritual and defeat the cherubim, keeping them from the secret portal to Eden behind their bedroom curtain. Setting: the festival of Yom Kippur, late afternoon of day 2, 5 days remaining. The National Institute of Mental Health. Perspective: Farah. Farah remembered the monsters in the cages. They had once been children like her, but grew deformed as they were experimented on by the doctors. She did not have many memories before the laboratory. She was only 3 years old when the spider droids killed her family and destroyed their underground Muslim community. One of Farah's memories was being held close in the house of prayer, where most children were not permitted. She and her mother were dressed in bright colors. She had the sense of being cherished. Then the droid carried her to their utopian lab, where she was nothing more than an animal. Soon, she was made like one of those caged children across the room, a science experiment gone terribly wrong. She overheard the scientist say that the girl next to her, a mute child named Kitty, will be released back into her utopian life. Farah tried to teach her words, but her efforts were futile. She needed the girl to tell someone about them so that they'd be rescued, but she did not seem to understand. In the end, all she could do was tell her to remember everything, and then she was taken away, presumably back to utopian society. Farah accepted her fate to be doomed in an utopian lab forever. But by some miracle, one of the scientists, Jade, went renegade. He released her and many of the other children and snuck them out of Utopia. She was sent to live in another Muslim community under the ground called Petra. The undergrounders did their best to reverse the effects of the serums that the utopian scientists had given her, and they were mostly successful. She regained her speech and lost all visible monster qualities, but she could not forget the haunted eyes of the children in the cages across the room. They could not be saved like her, for they were too far transformed. She carried their story the way she had wanted to send out her own story with the mute girl. They were a part of her now, and she could never forget them. Having nearly become a monster changed her in more ways than one. She could glimpse the world beyond mortal eyes and perceive spiritual aspects of it never meant for a young girl of flesh and blood. She could sense the jinn and angels who followed people around as they competed for souls, distinguish between shadow and demon, and more importantly, between human and monster. Most monsters lived in Utopia. They looked like young white-coated doctors and nurses who dressed in pink chauffeur. Farah knew the reason she was granted these strange powers. A part of her soul was broken, and as a result, wisps of the dark mist between life and death seeped through the cracks. She was once cherished, but Utopia had made her an orphan who understood the scamper of rats and the darkness of shadows because she had become like them. Her sixth sense alerted her the day her new underground home was attacked. She was only 14, but observant. The mice did not immediately scamper away from her when she crossed their path. They sensed something much worse on their scaly, snake-like tails. They were a breed which escaped from our utopian lab and had unfortunately flourished. Their bites were poisonous, but that was the last thing she worried about that day. Before she could warn anyone, fire and flames filled the tunnels. The tunnels quaked as the Sparta droids burst through. The droids were ordered to spare only the children. Farah barely made the age cutoff. Instead of being crushed, she was brought to the institution. For a second time, Artopia had taken away everything. The raid was part of an Artopian campaign to rescue underground children from their savage families, to give them a better life in the city. The charity was a farce, of course. Artopia just needed fresh new organs to harvest and people to experiment on. They were taken to a unit of the institution called NIMH, the National Institute of Mental Health. No one recognized her as one of the children who escaped 10 years before. Having once been a test subject, she could not be deceived by the friendly nurses who tried to make her take poisonous medications. It was the same medications she had once been given by men in biohazard suits, but in lesser concentrations. At first glance, NIMH did not seem like a government facility. The center was formulated by intrinsic scientific research to be the ideal children commune. The walls and interior were projected with bright scenes of clear blue skies and paradise-like environments. On one side of the room, Farah sat with a few teens like herself as they were taught critical math theory by a robotic teacher. The younger children sat on the other end, listening to a nurse read from an interactive storybook about two boys who fell in love and raised mutated animals together. Farah knew that behind it all was a diabolical drug cartel. Artopian children were also on the unit. These were generally the ones who had difficulty fitting in with their peers in the outside world and needed additional medications. Most Artopians spent at least a month or two on the unit at some point in their lives. Those who could not fit in or refused their medications were sent away to the basements to be experimented on, Artopian and non-Artopian alike. From there, most were sent to the mountains of NIMH. Medication non-compliance was the most graven sin in Artopia, where it was believed any problem or personality defect could be fixed with the right pill. Farah found ways to avoid the medications while not making her dislike of them apparent. She taught many of the other children these techniques as well. The main reason, however, why she was able to avoid being sent to the basements again was because of one thing. She was best friends with Avery. Avery was Kitty, her long-lost friend who she had sent out with her last words. At least, she thought she was. Kitty could at least repeat words, but Avery couldn't say anything. Still, Farah recognized Avery as necessary from the very beginning, and she did her best to become close to her again, as they were when they were in the basements together. Avery was Iskander's adopted daughter, and was treated like a princess by the staff. She even had her own special room, which she shared with Farah, while the other kids had to sleep in dormitories. Whenever other kids made fun of Avery for not speaking, Farah was right there to push them away. Farah knew she was smart for doing this, because if she hadn't been Avery's friend, she would have been sent away a long time ago due to her mutations. Despite all of NIMH's efforts, Farah was not resembling a typical Artopian. Besides for one other girl, all the underground children from Farah's home had been sent away to the basements. Luckily, Avery liked her more than any of the other children. Farah tried very hard to be her friend out of necessity, but she genuinely loved Avery. She understood her because she had been there in the basements too. Avery didn't really acknowledge her though, not like she did when they were in the basements together. Avery didn't acknowledge anyone for that matter. Farah determined that they must have experimented on her, causing her to be completely mute, and then changed her name before Iskander adopted her. Avery was like a bird in flight, not of the earth. Its subtle undercurrents that tell the matter were all she needed to know. Her shadow, her twin cast below but not identical, was all they needed to know. This did not bother Farah. Avery was easy to get along with. The only thing Farah didn't like so much about her was that she was scared of windows. Avery would have to have the curtains closed in every room she was in, and if the nurses didn't close them quickly, everyone would have to hear about it for a long time. Even on the 50th floor of the institution, she had to have those windows covered, or else she'd scream or cry. Farah wondered what terrible thing had triggered these fears, but it really could have been anything, considering she had often accompanied Iskander to the basements. At that moment, Iskander entered NIMH with timid Avery in tow. Iskander liked to parade Avery around sometimes, as she was pretty, doll-like, and always perfectly silent. Having a daughter was a promotional gimmick. It made him seem softer. Other than once a week, though, the girl remained in NIMH with Farah. The nurse took charge of Avery, and Iskander left. Farah listened to a bit of her critical math lesson before she got up to accompany Avery.
And if the car is traveling 30 miles per hour, how long will it take to arrive at the Colosseum?
5 minutes,
said a child.
Yes, Rachel, you're right. Have you ever been to the Colosseum?
No, my family were undergrounders.
Oh, how terrible.
said the teacher.
They did not think it was good for kids to have fun and see the circus, did they?
I guess not,
said the girl, even though an undergrounder would never have been allowed in Artopia, let alone the Colosseum.
Class, do you know why undergrounders don't believe in the circus?
A bunch of the Artopian children try to answer at once.
because they don't have enough money to buy a ticket,
Because they are judgmental and hate fun places,
because they are ignorant.
were the responses. The assigned custodian to her group only gave her a side glance as Farah quietly left the room. She could leave whenever she wanted, as long as it was to be with Avery. Hey, Avery, Farah said. Avery ate a sandwich at a table and did not speak. Still, Farah asked, what was Iskander working on today? Avery remained quiet. Farah didn't know exactly why Avery couldn't talk, but Iskander once mentioned it was because of the chemicals she was exposed to before being born. Deformities or intellectual disabilities were non-existent in Artopia, since all children were perfected through gene therapy as embryos. Only Iskander was allowed to have a child like Avery. Farah had only ever known one other girl who couldn't talk like her, but she had been another undergrounder. It's okay, said Farah, after she finished her sandwich. She knew that Avery couldn't answer back, but she liked to talk to her like she was a regular person anyway. Let's go back to our room so you can get some rest. Avery needed a lot of rest. Noises seemed to gnaw at her ears like the way Iskander's pets gawed at their prison bars. Farah didn't talk much to Avery, but she stayed close to her. Around Iskander and the doctors, Farah portrayed herself as carefree, happy, and naive. But when they weren't around, she was a quiet, calculating, and brooding girl. Avery liked the peace this gave her. Anyone else would have been too much. Although not large, the girl's room was very extravagant. Space was a precious commodity in the institution. Facilities usually had to rely on optical illusions to make places seem bigger. A beautiful projection at the back of their room covered the window. All the windows of NIMH were covered by white fabric screens that could be rolled up or down. The screens projected images of beautiful scenery. Because of her phobia, every window that Avery passed had to be covered. Therefore, all the windows on NIMH were kept covered all the time, just to be on the safe side. Iskander wanted to make Avery's electric tapestry prettier than all the rest, so he designed a unique scene more intricate than the others. The curtains stretched the length of the wall and displayed an Eden-like world filled with happy children, bioengineered fantastical animals, and fruit trees. Over them all, flying the sky, was Iskander, his wings curved around the scene. Avery adored the curtain. Farah suspected this had nothing to do with the mural, but because it covered the windows. Farah explained to Avery that nothing bad was outside those windows, and even if there was, they wouldn't be able to break in because they were so high up and the glass 4 inches thick. This did not matter to Avery.
Why does it matter?
A nurse said to her once.
The sky dove outside is just another mural anyway.
Farah left Avery in the room to grab a snack before the kitchen closed. In the hall, she saw Nyla, trying her best to get to the kitchen. Nyla was the only person left that had come from Farah's underground community. She shuffled as fast as she could, but her legs only seemed to move a few inches at a time. Farah grabbed a wheelchair and scooped her up on the way. Together, they made it right before a nurse locked the doors. Farah made it a point to sit with Nyla as often as possible when they ate their sandwiches. The food was terrible, cardboard compared to the wonderful, delicious food of the underground, which in her community was halal and non-GMO. Apparently, Artopian scientists discovered that formaldehyde and preservatives in food improved the behavior of people, especially unruly adolescents, so they pumped everything full of it. Farah noted her friend as she nibbled on her synthetic turkey sandwich. She was once one of her best friends. She missed her quick wit and bright eyes. Now, talking was difficult for Nyla, so Farah did the talking for them. Artopia had a way of taking away voices from people. Once Nyla managed to escape the institution for 3 days, Farah smiled, recalling her friend's ventures. She took shelter at the only place she knew where she'd be safe, at an illegal drug house in the city's poorest district. They asked her why she wanted to stay there, and she told them simply to escape drugs, and they had understood. The institution supplied the poor districts with drugs to have an excuse to arrest those who risked selling them. Those caught would have their children taken away and be forced into slave labor or funneled back through NIMH. The illegal dealers would not report her and gave her shelter out of sympathy. The dealer who had let her stay explained that he had once been experimented on in the basements of the institution, and so didn't mind helping other escapees. They had thought him dead and thrown him on a pile of bodies in the morgue. He'd miraculously woken up from his coma and was able to sneak out and build a secret life for himself in Artopia. Nyla paid her board by helping to mold the powder into little pills. Ironically, the illegal drug house was the only place in all Utopia where she was not forced to take drugs. Unfortunately, her conscience caught up to her, and she decided to leave the drug house one night and slept in a gas station bathroom. The next day, she was discovered and handed back over to the institution. When she first got back, she would talk all the time about how much better that gas station bathroom was than being stuck at NIMH. The doctors took it personally and decided to shut her up forever. Farah knew the doctors kept Nyla on the unit instead of sending her to the basements so they could show her what they wanted to do to her. Everyone knew Avery could only protect her for so long. She whispered to Nyla in their own language, "And on the day when he shall gather them together, it will seem to them as if they had not tarried on earth longer than an hour of a day. They will recognize each other." She quoted the Quran 10 verse 45 and then added, "On that day, you will be made just the way you were intended to be, brighter and better than any of the doctors and nurses here." After dinner, Farah wheeled her friend back into her room and returned to her own. Avery was waiting for her, sitting up in bed with a stuffed animal pressed tightly to her chest. Farah knew what she wanted. Every night, Farah would tell her the same bedtime story, but it never got old for Avery. Farah sat down and cleared her throat. Once upon a time, there were two girls who were very good friends. Together, they tied their bedsheets to a bedpost and pried open their window with a makeshift pulley. They slid down their bedsheets out of the window and ran away together into the night. Then everyone lived happily ever after. Amen. Avery flapped her hands like she was a bird and could fly right out of there. She did that when she was excited. She made happy, laughy noises. It was kind of funny to Farah, too. Avery couldn't even look through the windows, let alone escape out of them. Still, Farah enjoyed this story. Telling it could get her in big trouble, but Avery wouldn't tell her secret. Avery was full of secrets. Chapter 16, Short Story, Part 2 of The Kids of NIMH. Midrash number 7. The Garden of Eden is being unlawfully guarded. God barred mankind from Eden by placing cherubim at its gate. Genesis 3 verse 24. The Holy of Holies was the first time since the Garden of Eden that heaven and earth could meet and God dwelled directly with his people. Inside the Holy Temple was also the first time after the Garden of Eden that cherubim are mentioned. Exodus 36 verse 8. The Garden of Eden and the Holy Temple are intrinsically linked. Quote, "And he knew that the Garden of Eden is the Holy of Holies and the dwelling of the Lord." Jubilees 8, Exodus 36 verse 8. The image of the cherubim on the veil covering the Holy of Holies represented that mankind was still closed off from the presence of God. Mary, mother of Jesus, was one of the young women called to help weave this veil for Herod's renovated temple. When Jesus died, he tore the curtain from top to bottom with its images of cherubim as verification that the entrance to the Garden of Eden was no longer guarded by cherubim. Matthew 27. This was no small feat, as it was said by Rabbi Simeon Gamaliel, the high priest substitute, that
the thickness of the veil of the temple was a handbreadth thick.
However, another mighty cherubim/seraph had taken the place of the cherubim that once guarded the gate. As a prior guardian of God, this Satan is unmatched in this ability. Quote, "You were an anointed guardian," also translated as covering, "cherub. I placed you. You were on the holy mountain of God. In the midst of the stones of fire you walked." Ezekiel 28 verse 14. The Satan, in his pre-fallen state, was supposed to function in an intercessory nature, like a Levitical high priest. Through feigned speeches of worldly love and pleasure disguised as spirituality, the devil is using his anointing to instead guard people from God and from the truth. The Satan is where evil meets religion. He can cover that which is good, as Korah's original jobs were to do, and by doing so, the Satan can twist things to incite rebellion against our Lord. This is why LGBT and transhumanism has grown so much in the church. The devil wears many faces, just like a cherubim. When speaking through Judas Iscariot and as a snake in the garden, the devil used words such as peace, Matthew 26 verse 49, you will not surely die, Genesis 3 verse 4 through 5, Rabbi, Rabbi, and other words of honor and flattery, Matthew 16 verse 22, Mark 14 verse 45. The devil sweet-talks us, but condemns us to God behind our backs. Quote, "And by peace shall destroy many," Daniel 8 verse 25. The temple was built to bring us back to the Lord, not keep us away from him. Title: The Consecration of the Firstborn. As God tells us to consecrate the firstborn, we should consecrate our first thought every day after waking to glorify God and to thank Him for life, no matter our circumstance. 40 days after Jesus was born, he was presented to the Lord by his parents, who brought 2 turtle doves as a sacrifice, as the law required for every male child who opened the womb. Luke 2 verse 21 through 24. Quote, "If he cannot afford a lamb, then he shall bring to the Lord as his compensation for the sin that he has committed 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering." Leviticus 5 verse 7. Setting: morning of day 3, 4 days remaining, the Children's Center of NIMH. Perspective: Farah. It started the following day. The doctors and scientists were saying things like, "It's almost done, the final transformation," and "leading humanity into its final victory." But all the talk of progression and celebrations was just a diversion from the awful truth. New test subjects were needed to help perpetuate Iskander's new final transformation. There is always a process, a protocol for everything in the institution. The nurses and doctors were not necessarily malicious. They were simply following orders. They were told that the protocols kept patients and staff safe and were mandatory for a civilized environment. But Farah knew that it was the protocols that made it possible for the team to torture, humiliate, and take away the freedoms of their patients at any moment. The unit was full of tension because the doctors knew they had to send away more kids to the basements. Reservations had to be filled. Beds had to be occupied. She was with Avery in the hall when screaming caught both of their attention, and they looked in time to see a group of kids, primarily undergrounders, being led out of the unit by a security guard, no doubt to the basements. Farah walked over and grabbed Avery's hand. "Come on, arts and crafts are starting up." Avery didn't look happy for arts and crafts like she usually did. Most people thought she was deaf and dumb, but Farah knew she understood reality better than many. Reality was a terrifying world of monsters, shadow creatures, dragons, werewolves, vampires, and zombies. Once a long time ago, Iskander visited Avery on the unit. She was having a fit and no one could figure out why. She threw things at the doors and refused to come out of her room. Farah said it was because Iskander sent some of her friends away to the basements, even though Farah knew Avery was actually upset because one of the nurses forgot to close the curtains.
"I do my best to cure every child,"
Iskander tried to explain to Avery.
"It is not my fault that the non-Autopian children arrive here sick. It is their parents' fault for not giving them the proper gene splicing. I love children, and I hate the non-Autopians for allowing their children to be born with defects or ineffective thinking patterns. Sometimes, more drastic measures must be taken to fix them than what we can provide here, and that's why we send them away."
Farah knew that being sent away meant being experimented on or having their organs removed for rich elites. Iskander noticed Farah staring at them, so he added with narrow eyes,
"Avery, you should try to find a friend, someone other than Farah, perhaps. Someone that we can condition to enjoy doing things like paperwork for us. Wouldn't that be great?"
Iskander forgot they had already conditioned Avery to like doing the paperwork. In response, Avery grabbed Farah's hand in a rare, surprising gesture that made Farah believe she knew nothing about the world or Avery's true capability to understand. Iskander huffed, and since Avery was now calm, he left. Farah was safe once again because of Avery. Tearing herself away from her memories, Farah walked with Avery into the art room together. In the middle of their arts and craft table was a live dove that was genetically altered to sit quietly. The bird shuddered softly and stared unblinking out of dull gray eyes. A small, slim boy with mousy brown hair asked one of the doctors,
When will my friend be back? Are they going to art class too?
Everyone sat around the big stainless steel table.
"In the next couple of weeks, and yes."
Said the doctor as he helped one of the nurses open the crayon boxes and paints.
Where do they go and what kind of things do they do?
Asked the boy as he grabbed a bunch of crayons and markers and scribbled over a piece of paper.
I think I'll draw what a creature looks like today,
he said.
"You are too hyper.
The doctor said, seemingly irritated by the boy's questions.
You are not following the tasks one by one. You are jumping ahead and getting too excited. Today we are only drawing the bird on the table, nothing else. Here, this will help you calm down and stay on task."
The doctor gave the child a pill and told him to chew it.
Tastes like strawberries.
"I'll prescribe 3 of these every day. They will help you not ask so many questions. It's a form of soft metal that'll build up in your brain and make you calm, so that you can't think about anything but the task at hand. It is very safe."
I don't want to take it.
The child pouted.
"You have no choice. All Artopian children must take medications like this to become simple and amazing logical thinkers. Besides, if you don't take the pill, we'll just put it in your food.
The doctor smiled reassuringly. At the end of the table, a girl spoke up.
That med is great. Very tasty.
She had already finished her picture of the dove, and about a dozen others that looked exactly like it. She started working on another. Farah knew her as just another of the majority of the kids of NIMH who traded mental health diagnoses like trading cards and did everything they were told to do blindly and without thought. She was a natural-born Artopian and not an undergrounder, so this wasn't surprising. She would have no trouble in Artopian society and would soon be let out of the ward.
I want to see my family,
the boy whined.
Deep emotional connections complicate lives, but the pill we gave you will help nullify such desires.
The boy nodded and dried his tears.
It isn't fair. He still gets to go home to sleep. I don't even get to do that,
complained a dog-like child.
Your father was ruled unfit to raise you, so you can't go back home to him. You are now a permanent ward of the institution, like the non-Artopian children. Your father committed a federal offense by selling cocaine on the black market, so he had to be punished. Having children is a great privilege reserved for only the best Artopians. Cocaine is an illicit drug that is not regulated by the state and therefore takes profit away from us. Your father should have sold these drugs we are giving you for the institution instead of selling rogue. But now, he'll help us test new drugs as compensation, and you, his son, is now our consumer, making up for the lost profit he took away from us.
The doctor gave the child a pill.
Its molecular structure is only slightly different than cocaine, but its consumption profits the institution and all of us.
My father never made me take any of his drugs, though,
said the boy, but the doctors ignored him. Farah wondered to herself if this boy was a son of one of the drug dealers that helped hide Nyla. She hoped it wasn't. It was rare to find kind Artopians who would help a homeless kid out.
You can't make me take these,
the boy argued.
You have no choice. Children do not gain bodily autonomy until their 16th birthday, and since you are a ward of the state, you must do what we tell you to.
The child took the pill begrudgingly.
I can't wait till my 16th birthday. I'm going to have a big birthday cake free of crushed up pills.
The boy sat still as he waited for the effects to start working.
That's the spirit,
said the doctor.
But by then, your physiology will be so used to these drugs, your brain having spent all its formidable years under their use, that you won't be able to function without them.
Farah noted the boy. Later, she would secretly teach him ways to avoid the pills. Across from her was a non-Artopian child who just had an arm amputation. Mutation had caused most of the hair down the arm to fall off, so the doctors removed it in an attempt to stop the mutations. Secured to the boy's arm was a hunk of replacement automail. The robotic machinery of the arm was sleek and very advanced. He didn't want to use it to draw, so he tried to use his other hand to sketch, but he couldn't keep the pencil on the page because his hand shook from all the central nervous system stimulants he was on.
I told you if you don't start using your robotic arm, we will replace your other hand with one as well,
said the doctor.
It's more advanced than your natural arm. Try it out. Draw a picture of the bird.
The boy begrudgingly picked up a pencil with a metal appendage. He barely had time to glance at the bird before the arm scribbled a perfect replica of it.
Did I do that?
Asked the boy.
All I felt was a tingle in my spine.
The doctor nodded approvingly and wrote down notes. The nurse came over to him with his Dixie cup of pills.
Do you know what these are for?
She asked him.
Yes, of course. This pill makes me more grateful. This one less annoying. This one to make me do my chores. And this one to make me obey.
Very good,
said the nurse.
You just might make a great Artopian.
The nurse glanced over at Farah and grimaced at her. Everyone knew she'd make the worst Artopian. Farah glimpsed the fur missing on her arm. She slipped the sleeves further down, and then shimmied closer to Avery to remind the doctors that she was her friend and therefore special. Rebelliously, she decided to draw a tiki crow instead of the dove. Sometimes, she enjoyed doing stuff to upset the nurses and doctors because she knew she could. There was a knock on the door, and the kids looked up happily as Nurse Joy walked into the room in her typical pink chiffon. She held a tray in her hands full of brownies and cookies for the children, along with the standard cups of more pills, and with it cups full of milk to wash them down. Some of the drugs were inside the brownies for the kids who didn't like to swallow them.
I don't need my brownie today,
said one of the children.
I can swallow it all by myself.
That is very good, Hannah. I am so proud of you,
said Nurse Joy.
Can you tell my mom that I did it without the brownie this time?
I'm sorry, Hannah. We already told you this. Your mother died when they destroyed your underground commune. She was too infectious to live because she wasn't a good girl like you who takes her pills.
The girl became quiet and looked away.
I am surprised no one has changed your name yet.
Added Nurse Joy, who quickly moved on to the other children, dispensing each child their treat and tablets. Farah eyed Hannah. The girl's face scrunched up in a grimace, and her eyes reddened with tears. Farah already warned her not to show emotion. If she did, she would be prescribed way more pills. Farah shook her head, and Hannah saw, but it was obvious the girl would soon cry. Farah picked up a pair of scissors and hoped that Hannah would understand. Hannah did, and quickly she took scissors and accidentally cut herself with them.
Ouch!
She yelped as she at long last could release her tears.
I was trying to cut a piece of paper and missed.
Farah smiled. Hannah had done good. She could cry and let out her emotions now, blaming it on the cut, and the doctors would not know that she was crying for her lost family. Farah tried to distract the doctors as a nurse bandaged the cut. I noticed that you have given us all Ritalin, said Farah. The Center of NIMH has done a study that rats who are raised with this throughout their childhood have significantly less GABA neurotransmitters in their brains as adults, even decades after ceasing to take the drugs. Lack of GABA raises the incidence of depression, anxiety, insomnia, and suicide. All the children looked fearfully at the little cup of pills and then at their doctors. The doctors looked at Farah with undisguised contempt.
A child like you has no business reading anything published by NIMH,
said the doctor. This was true. Such research was kept highly confidential, and reports of side effects were routinely censored on the web. Farah stole one of the scientist's tablets and discovered the information herself.
A little anxiety is good for the system. Besides, by age 21, every Artobian is started on antidepressants. Food all works out.
And what do you think those antidepressants are doing to the brain? Asked Farah. One of the other doctors quickly interjected.
We don't know how most of these drugs work, but they are very effective. You won't believe how effective they are.
He smiled broadly. But Farah knew precisely how the drugs worked. She had seen it repeatedly. Most of the drugs lobotomized people little by little until their brains became soggy and only efficient enough to work basic repetitive jobs and to be perfectly content doing so. She shook her head. The nurses and doctors didn't care, but the other children did. They perked up their ears when Farah mentioned such things. She taught many of them secrets from what she learned from the stolen tablets. Title: Counteracting Psychotropic Drugs. The easiest trick was pretending to swallow the pills and spit them out later, but it was easy to get caught this way. Those who were caught would be given their medications via injection into the fatty tissue of the thigh or butt. The injection stayed inside a person for 2 to 6 months, and there was no way to remove it. Faking allergic reactions was the next recourse. When they prescribed her methylphenidate, HCI, she purposely starved herself, weight loss being a common symptom of the drug, so that the doctors would take her off of it. She faked convulsions for another drug known to cause tics and feigned excessive sleepiness for those that worked as sedatives. She'd have to keep up the act for an entire month sometimes, but it was worth it when they took her off the drugs. If faking allergic reactions did not get the doctors to discontinue the medications, she used natural antagonists. When she was prescribed lithium, she made sure to take the meds with salty foods, as the salt acted as an antagonist and expelled it from her system. Whereas right before her lithium levels were tested, she would stop eating salt, as a loss of sodium would cause the levels of lithium to be increased. When prescribed Adderall, she'd eat food that contained large amounts of citric acid and vitamin C, since it would prevent the absorption of Adderall into the body. She'd drink fruit juices, soda drinks, and foods with high levels of preservatives an hour before and after taking Adderall. Grapefruit juice was a different story. It prevented certain drugs like Allegra, for example, from entering cells, reducing their effectiveness. But it increased the effectiveness of all the drugs that Farah actually worried about, like SSRIs, such as Zoloft. Grapefruit did this due to its effect on the gut and liver enzymes. Grapefruit basically blocked the enzymes needed for SSRI's metabolism. Farah never ate grapefruit or anything like it. For her antidepressant and antipsychotic meds, she took vitamin E and vitamin K supplements to decrease their absorption. She simply asked her nurses for all these supplements and they gave them to her. They were not aware of the antagonist or synergistic relationships between the medications like she was. Alcohol lessened the antidepressant action of transliterates antidepressants, TCAs, but it increased their sedating effects. Barbiturates, known as sedative hypnotics, were her least favorite. For these, she'd take baking soda mixed with water. The baking soda speeded up the excretion of the drugs by causing an increase in serum pH and an increase in extracellular sodium, causing urination. It worked okay for barbiturates, silicides, or even methyl alcohol. Farah turned her attention to Avery. She was poking at a piece of cardboard but not doing much. Farah took the cardboard and applied glitter, streamers, butterflies, and rainbow colors to motivate her. Recycled paper and boxes made up much of the art and crafts material they used. On the opposite end of hers and Avery's was a label for a new antipsychotic med geared towards 6-year-olds. Try to draw the bird. Farah encouraged Avery as she put the cardboard back down in front of her. To her surprise, Avery looked up at the bird, studied it for a moment, and then picked a gray marker and traced what seemed to be a bird shape on one side of the paper. Soon, though, the lines overlapped, and a jumbled, scribbled mess ensued. Farah had the suspicion that Avery was trying to draw the dove like it was flapping its wings and flying, as a bird ought to do. "It's okay, Avery. Let me help you." Farah took her hand to the other side of the poster and outlined the image of a dove for her. Usually, she and Farah worked on their own projects, but Avery didn't mind. Farah guided Avery's hands to the bird's wings and feet so she could color them in. The nurses made a lot of noise about it because Avery drew something recognizable for once, even though it was only because Farah helped. Later that evening, before heading to bed, Farah folded her Tiki Crow drawing and placed it into her pocket so that she could visit one of the newest additions to the ward. She was depressed about all the children sent to the basements earlier in the day, and she felt that if she could help at least one kid before bed, she would feel better. He was an Artopian boy who'd been on NIMH for a week for taking too many pills, allegedly trying to commit suicide. Medically, he could have been released the first day, but the unit kept him because he had good insurance. The boy didn't understand this. He didn't know why they weren't letting him go. Farah overheard him arguing with a nurse.
"I must go home. I've been sitting here in the same clothes for a week. It's impossible to sleep with all the lights and vitals being taken every 4 hours. Why can't I just leave?"
Farah knew what they were doing to him. Whenever the institution needed more test subjects, more kids, they would involuntarily admit patients and then deny them basic things like proper clothes and sleep-deprive them with routine vital monitoring. Making the patient keep his clothes also increased the chance of them trying to make a run for it. After the nurse left, the boy got up and began walking to the door. Farah walked in and put her hands out to block him. "Please," she said, "I can help you escape, but now is not the right time. There are too many nurses on the unit." The boy pushed her hard out of the way. He never wanted to listen to anything she said and was always extremely mean. Instead of leaving, he got right up to her face to berate her one more time.
"Listen, I'm not one of you freaks. I don't belong here. You do, but not me."
"You don't understand," said Farah. "Being an Artopian doesn't mean anything here. We're all disposable." But this angered the boy even more.
"I'm a Artopian. Do you have any idea who my parents are? They're rich. They donate to this place. It's a mistake I was brought here. You're just an undergrounder scum, and a Muslim one at that. Not even the other undergrounders like you. I'll be out in no time, and then you're going to be in so much trouble."
Farah knew he could get her in trouble. Any of the kids she tried to help could tell on her. Still, she never let this get in the way of her actions. "Please," said Farah, "it doesn't matter how powerful your parents are. The institution announced a mandatory quarantine for everyone in the hospital. Your parents aren't even allowed to visit you, let alone get you out of here." She was thinking of ways she could sneak a set of key cards to him. Something, just anything to make such an escape attempt possible. But it was too late. The boy made a break for it, and there was no longer anything she could do. As he ran down the hall, the plastic, benign-looking nurses metamorphized into ravenous beasts as they all jumped on him. Security was called. The boy screamed as he tried to defend himself from their claws and kicks. Someone injected him with the medication to calm him down, as per protocol, but the drug, as designed, made his heart rate beat twice as fast and induced an even more panicked state. The boy cried and pleaded as they tied him down onto a gurney and forcibly stripped him of his civilian clothes as per protocol. As per protocol, all further temperatures were taken rectally as the boy lay half naked and exposed for everyone to look at. Dehumanization was part of the process. The protocols were constructed in such a way that if just the smallest reaction was triggered, a domino effect could be created. Anyone, even the most normal, level-headed person, could end up half naked and stripped to the same gurney as the boy if a nurse wished it, or if someone in the higher echelons of the institution desired it. Despite all of this, the nurses and doctors really thought they were good people, helpful people, and yet they were the evilest people of all. Most Nazis did not think they were doing wrong when they threw Jews into concentration camps.
We are quarantining them,
They'd say.
They have TB. We are only protecting the healthier Jewish community. It is not wrong.
They'd say as they threw them into ovens.
They are suffering. They have TB. No one has any food. We are doing the humane thing. They'd have contaminated the others. We are saving Jews, not killing them. Even more would have died if we didn't do this.
The boy was no different as those concentration camp Jews, as she, like the nurses, like the Nazis, had the same amount of patience. She hated the Utopian boy. Like the nurses, she wanted to help the patient, and his inability to listen had offended and worn at her. She saw the rationale of the nurses, but she also knew the pure and utter evil in that perfect and foolproof rationale. At the end of a long day, she too got some sort of perverse pleasure out of seeing him finally punished for his stupidity and rudeness. But unlike them, she ran away into the darkness of her room as she resisted the urge to go into the hall, gawk, ooh, and awe along with the nurses as they watched their latest victim get ripped apart like an antelope by lions. This is what hell does to people. And this is what she learned during the years on NIMH. To be good, a person must be able to resist their own urges, their own justifications, rationales, gut instincts, and to listen instead to the word of the Lord. The Utopian boy who spit and cursed at her, whose religion contradicted her own, was not just a mere human, but a creature made in the image of God, just as she. He was scared and wanted to leave. He was being treated as an infected prisoner, and as such could not help but act like one. She must obey God and save the boy because God told her that he loves every creature, and the pinnacle of those creatures is man. Farah could remain Avery's friend forever and live in peace and comfort. She could even become one of the nurses, one of the lions, another of Avery's handlers. Iskander would have been happy to promote her like this if she complied and didn't get into trouble all the time, but she would not stop. She would die trying to free the children of NIMH, even though it was impossible to save even one of them, and everything she did was futile and ridiculous, because she would rather be a fool than another one of hell's demons. Finally, she and Avery returned to the dormitory. While at NIMH, they were more like shadows being cast here and there by the flickering of the guards' flashlights or the brightness of fluorescent lights. Farah took her picture out of her pocket and taped the tiki crow to the wall and got ready for bed. One of the nurses who checked on them laughed at the art piece, but it didn't bother Farah. She laughed at the face of adversity. Before going to sleep, Farah told Avery their bedtime story like she did every night for the past year. Once upon a time, there were two girls who were very good friends. Together, they tied their bedsheets to the bedpost and pried open their window with a makeshift pulley. They slid down their bedsheets out of the window and ran away together into the night. Then everyone lived happily ever after. Amen. Avery laughed and flapped her hands like one of those birds her name claimed were inside of her. Then Farah got up and walked to her bed near the window. Before laying down to sleep, she took Avery's poster with her two turtle doves and wrote "Help" and "SOS" in big hook letters on it. Farah added many of the names of the ward's children to the sign, especially those who looked like they'd be sent to the basement soon, including the name of the Utopian boy, although it was probably too late for him. I'm going to stick this sign through the window. Maybe one of the children's parents will see the names written on it and remember their kid and come back for them, explained Farah to Avery as she tied one of her red ribbons around the sign to hold it out by. Usually, Avery had a fit whenever she touched the window, but this time she didn't say anything. Farah was careful not to upset the mural. Farah hesitated when she saw Iskander's face. To Avery, it looked like he was protecting them from whatever was outside, but to Farah, it looked more like he was guarding her from it, or even threatening her to stay away. Sometimes, his smile seemed more like a snarl. Farah lifted the bottom of the curtain just enough to reveal the ventilation rubber along the border. Most of the windows of the institution weren't real, but screens that projected images of the city. It could be impossible to tell the difference. Because of the ventilation tape, Farah was sure that their window was real. There was no way of opening the windows since they were cemented in. However, when Farah removed the insulation tape in between the 4-inch thick glass, the space was just big enough to slide the poster of the doves through. Sure enough, she felt a slight breeze when she removed the insulation. She hung her 2 turtle doves out the window as a plea for help and as a prayer to God. The curtain was the barrier between her and the Holy of Holies, and Iskander was the cherubim guarding the entrance to the real and true Garden of Eden, not his fake mural paradise. The doves were their offering, and the red ribbon like the red rope of Rahab. As they fell asleep, the sign tapped on the glass every so often when the wind kicked it up. Farah hooked the sign with red ribbon which she hid behind the books on the windowsill. The sign flipped and flopped in the wind like a fish. As she listened, Farah imagined a parent or relative of one of the children there, seeing the sign and coming to rescue them. Maybe one of the undergrounders disguised in an Artopian would see it, stage a rescue party, and save them all. But then, as the shadows grew darker and took on the forms of snakes and spiders because she had forgotten to take antagonists for her sedatives, she saw the truth. As the sign flipped and flapped in the wind from the view below, it would look just like all the other streamers and victory flags attached to the building. Their sign would be no different than all the others that read, "The New Normal, Build Back Better," and "Stay Safe, Stay Under the Dome." Someone looking up from the ground would just assume her sign was just like the rest of them. She had done nothing but join in on the propaganda. Farah began to sob. "All my friends have gone away, but all they wanted was to go home. They wanted to go home, like I want to." She cried and prayed. She prayed in her own language. Speaking in Arabic, Aramaic, Hebrew, or especially Yiddish was illegal in Artopia, as these were the languages of the undergrounders. But for once, she didn't care who heard her. It was all she had left of her home and family. A sound emitted from behind the curtain-covered window. Farah stopped her movement and sat very still. She gazed in fear as she listened for the strange sound again. Perhaps Avery was right, and some malicious force had come to sneak in through the window and finally destroy them all. This time, it was a bit louder, more insistent. The tapping didn't sound like the tapping from the sign. This tapping was rhythmic. Farah looked back to make sure Avery wasn't watching, and then slowly, she leaned over the window and gently lifted the curtain to peek. The strangest thing looked up at her. A little rainbow-colored bird perched on her windowsill. It was sparrow-like. "Is this a real bird or a robotic spy?" wondered Farah. "Is this some kind of fairy or CGI trick?" The little rainbow-colored bird shimmered like it was a star that flew out of the sky dome. She wanted to touch the little creature to see if it was real. When she reached her hand out, the little rainbow-colored bird leaped right through the 4-inch thick glass and danced a little flutter. Farah went into her dresser and grabbed some crackers she'd smuggled into the room. She gave it to the little bird, who pecked at it and ate a few of the crumbs. The little creature curtsied, and Farah couldn't help but laugh. Across the room, Avery rustled as she woke up. Farah wanted her to see the little rainbow bird too, but when she looked back at the creature, it was hip-hopping and shuffling over to the window. It moonwalked through the veil and into the night. Avery yelled as Farah got up to open the curtains. She was hoping to see the bird fly as she pulled the screen away in her excitement, having forgotten about Avery's fear. The dark room burst into brilliant light. Farah screamed, "It's the aliens!" But Avery stopped crying, overcome by awe. Their gowns blew as a gust of wind filled the room, but that was impossible because everyone knew those windows were 4 inches thick. Not alien," said Avery, to Farah's surprise. She had never heard her speak before. How could she know these things weren't aliens? Did she learn something in the basements that she did not know? It didn't look like a spaceship, but an entire city. A low humming and a distant trumpet resonated from the strange apparition. The city was huge, but somehow it tilted itself downwards to reach their window. The holographic city hovered at an impossible angle, and parts of the city overlapped the Artarpian buildings, but no one in the bustling cars outside seemed to notice. The rainbow castle slid out through their window, through the sky dome and beyond. It was like Farah and Avery could walk right up it past the sky dome and into the real sky. Farah heard of the Rainbow Castle from her underground community, but for whatever reason, she had never seen it before. A golden road reached out from the window and to their feet as it descended upwards on the tilted axis of the floating city. Avery moved to climb up the golden road, but Farah grabbed her hand, and so they stood and watched the colors play out. The city didn't seem alien. In fact, there was something incredibly familiar about it. They could see ruby walkways, houses that sparkled like cut quartz, corridors that led to inviting doors, vast flights of stairs leading up to pear-shaped towers and onion domes. Some of the domes were stretched into the sky dome so they looked more like flames flickering through the surface. It looked and felt like they could walk right out their window and up one of the spiral staircases. Farah saw that her sparrow had rejoined a small flock of rainbow birds made of the same living light. It looked and felt like they could walk right out their window and up one of the spiral staircases. She didn't know how long they stood gazing at the city before it evaporated like morning dew on the grass. Avery looked at Farah. Her shirt was soaked with tears, but she didn't look sad. Like Farah, Avery had never seen the Rainbow Castle. Iskander kept her from ever leaving the institution. Since the age of 3, she lived her entire life inside the pearlized white walls. She didn't remember anything about her life before then. The windows of the institution had a film inside of them that was supposed to keep people who could see the Rainbow City from seeing it, just like the Sky Dome did. Somehow, even through all these filters, Farah and Avery saw the light. Far past the Sky Dome, the Rainbow City reappeared. They could barely make out its lights as it swirled, flickered, and danced inside the clouds like flashes of lightning. Dark wisps of smoke and smog appeared over Artopia, where the rainbow light had just been. The Rainbow City moved closer to the world because of the sincere prayers of 2 girls, and as a result, atmospheric pressure was building. There was tension in the air, a dry electric energy forming. The wind blew at the sign, making it bounce up and hit the glass even harder, but the girls did not take it down. Perhaps they should have. Instead, they fell asleep deep into a whimsy dream.